Let's take a look at the part of Chapter 4 that is on market failures, which is when markets fail to produce the right amount of a product. They're rare, and there are also government failures, which are caused when government fails to find an efficient solution. But the demand curves should reflect full willingness to pay. Supply curves should reflect all cost of production. If this doesn't happen, then we have something called an externality or spillovers to third parties. So an externality is a cost or benefit accruing to a third party external to the market transaction, or in other words, it is a spillover to third parties, someone other than the buyer or seller. That can be positive or negative. Positive externalities exist when too little is produced. They're demand-side market failures. Negative externalities arise when too much is produced, or in other words, the suppliers do not bear the full cost of production. So they can be encouraged or discouraged by either taxes or subsidies. But let's look at what happens with positive externalities on the right. The government might subsidize the activity to those consumers. A good example here is vaccines. The government subsidizes vaccines because they have positive externalities. Those who receive the vaccine benefit, of course, but people who do not receive vaccines also benefit because those diseases are not floating around and they still benefit. So that would be an example of a positive externality. Another thing that might happen, we're just going to go ahead and skip over and look at this slide on positive externalities. Another thing that could happen is that the suppliers could be also subsidized to encourage more production, like maybe subsidizing vaccine makers to produce more. So the result being, of course, that the equilibrium moves farther to the right in the quantity, and more people will consume those goods because that's the purpose. It's a positive externality. So those arise when there are positive benefits to third parties. I suppose we could also put education in the positive externality spillover category. Even though public education is also a public good, it's paid for by the taxpayers, it can also create positive externalities, benefiting communities because more people are educated. So, of course, education is subsidized. It's completely paid by the taxpayer in K through 12 education. It's a public good, but it can also create positive spillovers to third parties, more educated communities, particularly in the case of K through 12, providing childcare for parents who work. So positive spillovers exist from education as well. Another example of really a positive spillover to third parties is, and this would be more in the market sector, when there's a concert at the American Music Pavilion down in Northwest Arkansas. There are a lot of people that pull up in their cars and can still hear the music. They can still see the screen often. So they're kind of free riders, if you will. They're not paying for the ticket, and of course, tickets are very expensive to some of those concerts. So they get benefits that accrue. They didn't buy a ticket, and the sellers, the promoters, did not get to sell them a ticket. So they get positive spillovers. So that's another example. Let's look back at the example of negative externalities. Correct for negative externalities, this can be through direct controls by the government. We have the Environmental Protection Agency, of course, that has rules that prohibit spills into creeks and rivers. If you see, sometimes you'll see an 18-wheeler driving down the road that has a sign on it that says, "I pay X amount in taxes, they are taxed more heavily because they do more damage to roads and bridges. So they have to pay what we call a Pigovian tax, or just a tax on anything that can cause negative externalities, whether it's a factory that's polluting that has to pay taxes to produce more. Those are put on the company to correct for the negative externalities. For example, if we look at this slide, we see that the supply curve without the T, the supply T is with tax, the supply curve lies farther to the right than it would if there's a tax on that producer. Of course, look at what happens to price. When there is a tax on that producer, the prices do go up to consumers, but it also might discourage production. A control has the same effect of decreasing the supply curve, whether it's only allowing a certain amount of production. And usually I see this term negative externalities to connote something that involves pollution or something like that. So we've already looked at positive. So these are some example dealing with negative externalities. Private bargaining, called the Coase theorem, just asking the offender to stop the pollution. Sometimes that works. There are liability rules and lawsuits, a lot of those in the U.S., of course. Taxes on the producers. There are direct controls, lots of government agencies that have direct controls on production. And market for externality rights, something called a cap and trade system, which gives permits for pollution. And a business that or factory that pollutes more has to buy more permits. But if they reduce their pollution, then they can sell those permits to somebody else that may need them. So that creates a market for externality rights. Of course, you've still got the pollution. But the goal would be always for those permits to go up in price. For positive externalities, when there's not enough, private bargaining, again, encouraging more production. Of course, that has happened with the coronavirus, COVID-19. A lot of private companies are trying to find a vaccine. They will likely be subsidized to the producer or to the consumer so that those vaccines can be obtained relatively inexpensively, or the government may provide them altogether, which means taxpayer paid for those vaccines. Again, the Coase theorem is just private sector bargaining, where the offending pollution or whatever is just discouraged, and that's private bargaining rights. But sometimes the government may try to correct for those externalities, but not really come up with a solution that works. In the last word in the chapter, it does give an example of reducing air pollution. And of course, we hear a lot about global warming or climate change. But cap and trade would set a cap for the total amount of emissions, again, assign rights to those emissions, and then those rights can be bought and sold. So obviously the one that finds ways to diminish their CO2 emissions don't have to pay as much for those cap and trade permits. Another way that would be probably easier to discourage emissions is a carbon tax. Just tax every barrel of oil, tax every gallon of gas, what have you. That would be fairly easy. But the bottom line is always that the supply curve will decrease, move to the left, and that means higher prices to consumers. So there are trade-offs. How much are people willing to pay? We don't really know the answer to that, but there is absolutely cap and trade policies, and carbon tax would raise prices to the ultimate consumer. So I believe that is all we need to cover about externalities.